Hi everybody, this is Mrs. Klamm, and I'm here today to show you a few watercolor techniques. What we're going to do is we're going to have half a piece of watercolor paper. We're going to try out several different techniques, including the splatter, crayon, alcohol, plastic wrap, wet on wet, salt, and tape. What you're going to need today is some Elmer's glue, some rubbing alcohol, and a Q-tip to go along with that. You're also going to need some salt. Any kind will do, just table salt is just fine. Also some masking tape, a straw, and some watercolors. Okay, so to get started, what we're going to do is tape the different individual squares on our watercolor paper. I have a pretty thick tape today, so it's going to cut back on the amount of area we can paint on. So when you do this, I would prefer, or you might prefer, to have a thinner tape. Make sure you press it down really firmly. You don't want any watercolor getting up underneath your tape. Alright, the first one we're going to start with today is just a wet on wet. And it's exactly what the name implies. We're putting a layer of wet watercolor over another layer of wet watercolor. Okay. I usually like to start off by wetting down my paper. Just makes the colors flow a little more easily. Let's start with a yellow. This yellow's in pretty bad condition, but it'll still work. I'm kind of dabbing this on. Remember that when you're using watercolors, you want to clean out your brush in between every color as to avoid mixing colors into your palette. Let's see, let's do a blue on the other side. A strong color. I'm going to kind of dab it over into this yellow here. Just grab a little more water to make it move a little more easily. Okay. So that's just a wet on wet. Simple as that. And I'm going to use that wet on wet to do my first watercolor technique. That's going to be alcohol. So I'm just going to take a little bit of alcohol on my Q-tip, and then I drop it onto my paper. Go from the side there so you can kind of see what I'm doing. You drop it on like that if you like, without touching the canvas or the paper, or you can actually touch it with the Q-tip. Kind of cool, huh? The next technique we're going to try today is going to be the salt. Okay, so once again, I'm going to wet down my square. Not too much, but just a little bit. Alright, now with the salt, like I said, just table salt will work. There's some sea salt. Just give myself a little bit in my hand. This does not require very much salt at all, so try not to put a whole lot on there. And just lightly sprinkle the salt onto your square. And it'll end up looking something kind of like this when it's dry. Splatter. Alright, next technique we're going to try is the tape. Now you can do this with Elmer's glue, or this rubber cement if you like. Today I'm not going to wait for it to dry though, so I'm going to use tape on here. And this technique can be used for when you're trying to stop an area from getting color on it. Okay, and once again, we're going to do a wet on wet. Okay, next technique we're going to try is the splatter. This is one of my favorites. We're actually going to use a straw on it. Okay. And how we do this is we take quite a bit of water on our brush and just dab the color onto your paper here. You can either actually touch the water down onto your paper, or you can just kind of splatter it as I'm doing here. You can also put your finger down and tap it like this. Me a little bit afraid for my computer screen, so I won't flick it quite like that. Alright, now as soon as you have some drops down, take your straw and give it a good burst of air. Alright, the next watercolor technique we're going to cover is called wax resist. And this is when you take some crayons and you just put down a layer of color, a layer of wax, and then as you paint over it with the watercolors, the wax will resist that water. And it's been my experience that the best colors to use are bright and light values. If you try and go darker, a lot of times it just doesn't show up very well. So here we go. Let's just do some random anything we want here. The thicker the wax is, the more it will resist the color. Alright, so here we go. Let's put another wet on wet down. As you can see here, one of the things that happens is if you use a wax color that's the same as the color of paint you're going to use or something similar to it, it won't resist very much and it just doesn't show up. However, if you have, say, a bright crayon and a completely different color of watercolor, it works better. Okay, the very last one I'm going to show you is one of my personal favorites, and this is called the saran wrap, as I call it, but it's really the technique of using saran wrap to bunch up pools of color and make a really interesting effect. This tends to work better, I've noticed, if you have a thicker layer of watercolor with a little more water in the paint. Do is you just take a chunk of saran wrap, just a small piece here, you kind of crinkle it and then lay it down on top of a layer of wet on wet. You see how that can start to pool those colors? That's what you want. Then set something on top of it. Work as good as anything. And there we are. Your last step on here is going to be to peel off your tape and then to label each of the squares. Once again, thank you for watching today. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you learned a little bit about some different watercolor techniques.